So since we're just a couple of minutes from 2 p.m., I'm going to share an NEDCC video just for those who are waiting. And if you're unfamiliar with NEDCC, it will just give you a chance to see what we're all about. So I'm going to advance my slide, but not that far, and share my sound. And hopefully you'll be able to hear it, but if not, they're nice images. And it looks like I had forgotten to change the time zone on my slide. It said Eastern, but we're operating in Central Time. NEDCC is located in the Eastern Time Zone, but I actually work remotely for NEDCC, and I'm in California, so I'm in Pacific Time. So there's a lot of time zone fluctuation happening. And so it looks like we are at 2 p.m. Central. So I'm going to go ahead and get started and start my timer.
Annie, before yes. You get started, is it Matthys? Is that how you say it?
No, it's Matthys.
Matthys? Okay, I just wanted to double check.
Yeah, that Y will throw you off.
Yeah, let me do one quick little introduction. I just want to thank everyone for being here today. And I want to thank our board for organizing this great program. I want to thank the Missouri Humanities Council for their continued support of our workshops here at the Missouri Association Museum and Archives. Annie Matthys is here from the Northeast Document Conservation Center, the NEDCC. And I will get out of your way now to do your presentation, but feel free to use the chat for questions, and then we will be using the breakout room function here, and all of that will be made clear throughout the presentation. So take it away.
Thank you for the introduction. I was just jumping in. But I just want to make sure that we're all set up before we get rolling. So just a reminder that these types of presentations do tend to use a lot of bandwidth. So you probably want to close out other programs that you have running. And I will probably make sure that microphones are all muted. And that's just to block out some background noise. But if you do have questions at any time, feel free to drop them into the chat box, and that will be our primary means of communicating with each other, but I'll periodically check that in case there's any questions going on. So I'm assuming everyone can hear me at this point and that we're all good on the audio end, but if you do have any issues throughout the day, Jamie Henry is hosting us. So I guess feel free to private chat Jamie and let him know if you're having any issues. And so welcome. And now that I've been introduced, but I will just say that, again, my name is Annie Matthys, and I am a preservation specialist at NEDCC, which is located in Andover, Massachusetts. But as I mentioned, I work remotely, and I actually live and work in San Mateo, California, about 18 miles south of San Francisco. But we have a national reach. So we work with different organizations all across the country. And today we're going to be talking about preparing for the unexpected, risk assessment, and writing a disaster plan. And we will be briefly using breakout rooms toward the second half, the end of today's session. So hopefully you can see the breakout room option. If not, maybe just let us know and we'll give breakout rooms a try. I'll be honest with everyone that I've used them in some capacity before, but this is my first time to really fly solo and getting breakout rooms running. So you get to be sort of a guinea pig for me today, so be gentle. But that's coming up. We'll see how it goes. And I'm also going to mention quite a few resources today. I'll share some links in the chat, but I do want to take the time to mention that you do not have to scramble to write down all of the resources or try to locate them online while I'm talking. I'm actually going to be providing you with a short link to a publicly shared folder that's going to have all of the digital handouts compiled and enclosed, including PDFs of today's slides. So I'm actually going to take the time at the beginning to drop that link in the chat, and I will do so again at the end today. And if you, okay, I see a few people are actually saying that they don't see the breakout room option. And if you don't see that under more on the menu either, and we end up not having it overall, I think that's okay. And that we don't necessarily have to force the use of breakout rooms if it's something that a majority of people aren't seeing. So definitely the thought activity that I have planned doesn't require them. So I don't think it's anything to worry about too much. Like I said, if we don't have to do it.
I just wanted to jump in.
Yeah.
We can assign them to the breakout rooms, or we can assign them randomly. So when you're at that point, just let me know and we can give it a try.
Sure. Okay. And like I said, if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. And we'll be perfectly fine sailing in the main room. So nothing to worry about if you don't see it. And if it doesn't work, like I said, it doesn't work. But here is the link to the shared folder that will have all of the resources that we talk about today. And I'll make a point to share it again as well. But it's going to contain a lot of good information, such as a risk assessment spreadsheet, outline for an emergency response plan, and the slides. And these are the topics that we're going to cover today. It's a lot of information, but we're really trying to orient everyone towards the process of assessing risks and getting everybody ready to write their disaster plan. So it'll start with talking about what is a disaster, both large and small disasters, and then we'll cover the fundamentals of emergency management and risk assessment. Afterwards, we'll get into looking for risks at different levels of scope, from our region to our building to items in our collection. And then we move into assessing the risks we've identified. And as we move into the second half of the session, we're really going to focus in on the emergency management cycle and what it looks like for cultural heritage institutions in particular. And based on that, we're going to discuss what your disaster plan should look like. There are still many topics that we actually won't be addressing today. So we're focusing on collection safety. So that means we're not talking about safety procedures for people. We're not talking about having like food and clean water to drink or first aid training. This is really focused on collections. We're also not talking about business continuity plans, the steps that you take to safeguard continuing operations. There's a lot of overlap with these other aspects of disaster prep, but our focus today is really on policies for your collections and institution. And everyone is going to have access to the disaster plan template through that publicly shared folder. It's the file that you're going to see named, I think it's 3.4 worksheet outlining emergency response plan. And we're going to walk that template later on today, but it's just that. It's one example of a template that you can work through, and you're free to edit it and add more to it and do whatever you need to customize it so that it's meeting your needs. It helps you to have something to start with, though, which is why we're building on that template. And of course, you can use it to take notes today if you wanted to pull it up. And before we jump into the content proper, I'm actually going to turn off my video at this point, but I'm going to turn it back on later. This is just so you don't have to see me wildly gesticulating with my hands as I tend to do. I feel like it would be distracting for me. So I'm going to turn my video off for now, but I'll see you all again here in a bit. So we're going to jump into understanding risk. And it's important to understand the risks to our collections, as that enables us to take action to better preserve them. And disasters can range from large historic events to the small and regional. So it's helpful to contextualize the scale of different disasters we can experience. And on screen here are familiar images of disaster, and they're often the sort of thing that people think of when they hear disaster plan or emergency preparedness. For me, living in California, that would be that upper left-hand image, which are wildfires, and that image is from a couple of years ago. And on the right, one in a series of tornadoes that hit Oklahoma in, I believe it was 2013. And of course, tornadoes are always something to keep in mind. I actually, though I live in California now, I'm from North Alabama, so I'm very familiar with tornadoes and trying to be prepared for those. And then on the lower left is a satellite image of Hurricane Irene in 2011. All of these are regional disasters that involve many levels of coordinated response. They are complex, and there are layers of community and governmental preparedness that need to be in place to manage them as effectively as possible. And as a collecting institution, you need to know where you fit into the larger picture of a regional disaster. A disaster plan, and especially the planning and training process, can really help with that. The newest ideas in emergency management really focus on resilience, and what that typically means for us in cultural heritage institutions is staying open or reopening very quickly. We provide our communities with valuable services. A functioning library or repository is part of daily life for many community members. So making sure we stay open or bounce back lets the people around us know that daily life is resuming after a disaster. And so shifting gears into the territory that I am sure is still on everyone's mind, there are also global disasters like COVID-19. And the fears and challenges you face are shared not just by everyone in your region or country, but also by people in totally different parts of the world all at the same time. And COVID-19 is a good lens through which to evaluate the nature of risks and disasters. I wouldn't be surprised if some of you actually signed up for this webinar because of weaknesses exposed in your institution by COVID-19. And I'll start by saying that COVID-19's risk brings up three major issues in how we need to approach disasters in general. The fact that that level of risk changes frequently, sometimes even day to day. I'm sure you can all remember at the beginning of 2020 when people were reminding each other that the seasonal flu was a greater public health risk in the United States than COVID-19. And of course, that quickly changed. This reminds us that when it comes to regional and global disasters, it's important to know where to get information so that you can do ongoing risk assessment that informs your planning. This goes for hurricanes, tornadoes, snowstorms, and fires, just as much as it would for a pandemic. The second point is that disasters can have a major impact on continuity of operations. And continuity of operations planning is a field adjacent to emergency preparedness. It's not about saving lives and protecting buildings, but it's about protecting businesses by ensuring critical functions stay operable, even in an emergency. And this virus has made it so that areas have had to close down periodically and staff have had to reduce access to their buildings, making it so that we've had to find alternative ways to carry out our critical functions. And for many people, of course, this has included a lot of teleworking. But this brings me to the last point about COVID-19 and preparedness. When something as terrible as a pandemic occurs, it draws everyone's attention and planning energy to it for a very long time, possibly well after that threat has actually passed. To a certain degree, this is completely appropriate. We need to know how to deal with the very specific risks that COVID-19 presents us with and make sure we remember what we learned. However, it's also important not to lose perspective, especially as collections care professionals who are already so overstretched with work. If our risk assessment is meant to inform how we prepare for the future, then we don't really want to fall into the trap of only preparing ourselves for what has most recently happened. It's quite possible that one day in our lifetimes we will face a disease outbreak that affects our daily lives again, but it probably won't be the very next disaster that affects your institution. Instead, it's important to consider how the steps we take now to prepare can be relevant to us for the next disaster that isn't a disease-related outbreak. That's essentially all hazards planning, and it will help you to write a plan that meets your institution's needs for a variety of potential risks. In terms of immediate lessons learned from COVID-19, many of us are learning that we need good methods for monitoring our buildings when we can't access them and good methods for working from home. And personally, I would rather see people address these needs in a plan called extended closure procedures rather than pandemic procedures. Try to make sure the planning you're doing will generally have a life well after the pandemic so that your efforts are as relevant to your organization in the future as they are now. But there are many kinds of emergencies, not just these large scale ones. And a lot of emergencies are caused in-house by simple errors. Industrial or environmental disasters can be caused by HVAC or power failure, through a construction accident, or through an accident outside your building that affects your systems. On the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see a burst pipe in an academic office that caused water to pour through the light fixtures. This is a really dramatic image of a very common problem for the Northeast where NEDCC is located. Almost every winter, there are burst pipes causing small emergencies in libraries and offices, just like this one. This can then cause secondary effects like a mold bloom or perhaps even a pest infestation because of the environmental changes. One disaster can lead to another, and we're arguably at more risk of incidents such as these having a larger impact than they might ordinarily due to COVID-19 and access restrictions that could still be in place. If staff aren't present in your building to spot a leak, how will we even know that it's occurred and is causing those secondary problems? And there are also human disasters. You can have situations caused by people acting willfully, such as arson or perhaps vandalism. And there are, of course, acts of terrorism, including cyber terrorism, which we won't talk too much about today, but I will briefly mention cyber terrorism again. And the point of this is really to demonstrate that disasters just aren't always about things like a huge F4 or F5 tornado. NEDCC has been on the site of numerous water disasters, and they're caused by everyday problems. At one place, a staff member from facilities accidentally left a cloth in a sink with the water running. And unfortunately, that room happened to be over the room with the company's servers. So then you have a leak. And personally, the public library system that I worked at earlier in my career had an entire branch library that was flooded because of an issue overnight with a water fountain. And it's not something that you would ever imagine would happen, but it did happen and put that branch's operations sort of in an alternative mode for quite a few months. The unifying thing among these situations is that disaster is sudden and we don't expect it. Cultural heritage employees are all very busy already with their normal day-to-day, trying to meet patrons' needs and deal with budget cuts and so on. So we don't have time to sit around worrying about what might happen. But whether it's a small mold outbreak or a massive roof leak, you can respond more quickly if you're prepared. And we want to be prepared up and down the scale of likelihood and severity. And there are lots of different ways to categorize the different types of emergencies, depending on the type of institution you're dealing with. We like to use UNESCO's guidelines, which classify disasters into two categories, and those are natural and man-made. It's a very straightforward way to approach this topic. And another thing I'll add is that even though we don't know when either of these categories of disaster will happen, we do know that it definitely will happen. And you can see here in this statement, no institution can be excluded from or is immune to the possibility of disaster. There is no group of people or institution or area that hasn't been through an unexpected threat. And every library system, every library that I've ever worked at, there's been some minor, sometimes more major disaster that's occurred. So it's usually not if, it's when. And UNESCO states that natural disasters cannot be prevented, but measures can be taken to eliminate or reduce the possibility of trouble. Regardless of the many forms a disaster may take, the actual damage to collections is usually caused by water or fire. Natural disasters are often the huge catastrophic storms and events that impact not just a single library or museum, but an entire region. And during these large-scale emergencies, you're usually following the instructions of local first responders and community leaders, because it's not just a collection disaster, but also a human disaster. And you'll see the picture, the image here on the slide is from an insect infestation at a library. Remember that these two count as natural disasters. And if you have an infestation, you would need to contact a conservator as well as an exterminator, because you don't want them spraying pesticides and dropping insect bombs on top of your historic collections. So you end up consulting two different kinds of professionals in that situation. And so now we'll also talk about man-made disasters. And these can be passive accidents or negligence, such as not closing the shades and blocking out natural sunlight, therefore causing your materials to fade, perhaps. So those general agents of deterioration of materials are often at play. That would be like your chemical catalysts. This is a really large portion of this category, even though you're seeing images here on the slide that are from active threats. And so the top image is a mailbox that had a small bomb placed in it. And the bottom photo is of an Egyptian Special Forces troops after they secured the Egyptian Museum following a rampage by looters who destroyed artifacts, broke some sculptures, and things of that nature. And also, I know a lot of public libraries sometimes have to deal with things being placed inside of book drops that aren't books or collections materials. So that's also something to think about. And I said I would mention it again. We should also think about cyber attacks, which are a bigger problem now than in the past, naturally. Libraries and cultural heritage organizations are turning into surprisingly frequent casualties of this kind of threat because the risk isn't on the radar for many of these institutions. They make great targets for novices who want to buff up on their skills in low stakes environments. And I don't want to be an alarmist, but it doesn't hurt to plan ahead for this kind of threat along with the others, or at least have it in mind. And one resource that I can share along those lines, share a link to here, is the PAR Cybersecurity Mitigation Checklist. Let me make sure that I have the entire link there. There we go. So maybe we can't stop disasters from happening, but we can be ready to respond in ways that lessen their impacts on both people and collections. And so now that we sort of have a basic understanding of the types of disasters, we'll move on to emergency management and risk assessment. So first, we're going to orient ourselves to the phases of emergency management and where risk assessment falls. So the very first step of mitigation and prevention is identifying what your risks are, seeing the potential problems due to your particular circumstances, such as your regional issues, local issues, or maybe the nature of the other buildings surrounding you. You can't prevent this damage or mitigate it if you don't see or understand those risks. And then comes preparedness. And this is the pulling together of resources. The risk assessment will give you a lot of the information that you need to do this. And it also helps guide your preparedness around the most likely risks that you have. And then during the second half of our workshop today, we'll cover some aspects of disaster planning and be talking more about response and recovery. But in the best case scenario, we enter the emergency management cycle in the mitigation and prevention phase. To begin our planning and build an emergency preparedness program, we start with risk assessment. And the process of assessing risk helps us determine what types of emergencies and events we should give the most attention to first. So, what exactly are we assessing? Well, we're identifying possible hazards. It's sort of like an imaginary stress test or thought experiment, and it causes you to see your building and collections area with a new set of eyes. So that stain on the ceiling that you've maybe passed by every day since you started working at your institution, maybe take a closer look to see if it's the start of a larger problem. And risk assessment involves a few things. In the process, we identify possible hazards, both natural and man-made. We identify the vulnerability of our collections and the impact that a disaster of a particular nature would have on them. For example, if I know that the HVAC system is 15 plus years old, what would happen if it failed? Or if you knew that there was some active mold lurking around in your collection materials. Risk assessment should be an ongoing process. And the state of our buildings is in constant fluctuation, especially with severe weather events that can tax their resilience. So the roof ages, drainage can get clogged, climate control equipment has to keep up with changing weather patterns, maybe building use patterns even change. These are all things we have to keep up with to properly know our buildings and really protect our collections. And it's safe to say that none of us can prepare for every disaster. We want to prepare for our most likely disasters and disasters that pose the greatest risk to ourselves and our collections. This allows you to apply a cost-benefit analysis and justify to your administration any changes you want to make or any mitigation-related expenditures. And it also helps guide your disaster planning around the most likely risks. Your disaster plan is a flexible document, but there are certain mitigation strategies that should definitely be addressed based on your risk assessment. So who should perform the risk assessment? Well, your institutional staff should do that. And at a minimum, this should include yourself and your facilities. Either you have a facilities department or maybe a facilities manager. Depending on the personnel structure of your particular institution, you may want to involve additional people such as directors or department heads. If you're relatively new to your institution, consider bringing in a staff member who's been there a while and actually knows about the history of the building. Involving other staff also helps you start generating buy-in for your disaster planning and your preparedness efforts. And your insurance agent can also be a partner in risk assessment, as can emergency responders. And responders are often brought in for code inspections, but you can also invite them for walkthroughs that are less formal if they're available. And they may notice things about your building and the surroundings that you haven't really considered. It's also beneficial for first responders to be familiar with your space for their own safety if they're responding to an emergency. And while recovery vendors won't perform the exact same kind of risk assessment, it's a good idea to ask them to do a site review so that they're familiar with the layout and problem areas before something actually happens. This may fall more into the planning stage of things, but they may also be able to point things out that you haven't seen before. So it's handy for risk assessment as well. And while we're talking about risk assessment, it's always good to provide examples. So I do want to mention a high-profile disaster that occurred in 2009. So in 2009, the Cologne Municipal Archives actually collapsed. After years of investigation, it was confirmed that the cause of collapse related to mismanagement and faulty construction of a metro line beneath the archives. Specifically, an issue with one of the underground walls caused so much water, sand, and gravel to flow beneath the archive that it eventually caused the building's foundation to crumble and wash away. In the days after the event, the German newspaper Der Spiegel observed that the collapse of the archives buried more than a millennium's worth of documents under tons of rubble. This was an incredible loss of not just for Cologne or Germany in terms of their history, as there were items in the city archive documenting the last 1,000 years of European history as a whole. And this is where the important lesson about risk assessment is, and why it's important to keep in mind that you need to keep seeing and looking at your building with a new set of eyes, not to ignore the warning signs. An emergency preparedness mindset in your organization can also empower other people to report things that they might notice. So as you'll see the quote on the screen, that the cracks ran through a number of neighboring buildings after the collapse. Cracks had likewise been discovered in the archive recently, but had actually been discounted And that's pretty shocking, right? And it speaks volumes to the importance of preparedness, which is something that starts by knowing your building and the surroundings beyond. So now we will actually start discussing how you can go about identifying the potential risks. And the most efficient way to assess your risks is through a site survey with 3 primary layers. And those are the setting, the building, and finally the collections. So we're going from large and broad to more small and specific. Like we were talking about in the who of the risk assessment section, you probably won't be able to answer every question on your own, and that's okay. You'll need partners and you'll need some tools to work with. And you'll also need some background knowledge to interpret mitigating factors like fire suppression equipment, and some knowledge about building terms can be very helpful as well. And we'll talk a little bit about some of those things. So natural hazards, of course, vary from region to region, like when we kind of looked a little bit at some examples of regional disasters. Some guiding questions that will help you identify risks that you might not be used to thinking about. So thinking about where are your emergency services and how long does it take for them to actually reach you? Are you a priority for them in a regional disaster? And their availability or lack of availability could impact how severe an incident could get for you once it occurs. And don't forget who your neighbors are. So big rules of thumb to consider here. Think about the proximity and nature of your neighbors. The closer they are, the more impactful their behavior might be for you. If they're directly attached to your building, ask yourself questions such as, do they cook or have open fires? Maybe they're a restaurant that could pose an additional fire hazard. Or do you have neighbors above you on an upper floor? They could be a potential source for water damage. So in some ways, unoccupied places can actually be even worse. Imagine the potential for something such as pest development and poor maintenance in an unoccupied space that might be attached to you or maybe within the same building. And then you can also consider things such as the nature of crime in your area and if there have ever been break-ins or burglaries. And so we're going to look at some natural hazards, like the ones we've already started talking about. So industrial and environmental hazards can relate to systems risks, such as power outages or gas and oil leaks, as well as your proximity to commercial plants in the area. And then human hazards can include things like crime, theft, and vandalism, as well as larger issues such as things like a riot or perhaps civil unrest. Technological hazards are also ultimately human hazards, but often mesh with issues like cybersecurity. With natural hazards, it's worth doing some research to see if your town or region has had federal disaster declarations. So exploring past incidents and really looking into your area's history of disaster can really help provide you with a more complete view of potential risks. And I know a lot of areas, specifically in Missouri, of course, tornadoes are a concern. Flooding is becoming a concern in more and more places as well. And I know that a library branch that I've worked at before was on a floodplain. So that's something that you would want to keep in mind when you talk about your risks and how to mitigate them. And this can get kind of in the weeds, but we do want to think about these industrial and environmental hazards, particularly when construction occurs. And so think about things such as HVAC failure or a power failure. Maybe there's a water main break, a train or auto accident, which yet again, another branch library that I worked at was close to a train track. So one of the things in our disaster plan was what to do if there's like a chemical spill from the train or something of that nature. Construction accidents happen, industrial accidents or fires, and even nuclear accidents. And this can all be very situational to your area, depending upon our location, whether we're in an urban, suburban, or rural environment. We have different kinds of industrial or environmental risks to really consider. And there are tools that you can reference to investigate natural and industrial risks in your area even further. For example, your local Office of Emergency Management will provide updates on current risks and response efforts, if any are underway, as well as information on the history of your area, which can be important too in evaluating the probability of certain types of risks. And we also need to be aware of incidents involving people. Maybe it's an accident, or it could be something intentional, like a political act. And on the screen here, you will see a painting by artist Diego Velázquez, which in 1914 was slashed with a meat cleaver as it was hanging in the National Gallery. It was an act of protest. So these types of things do happen, and there's something to take into consideration as well. And so I always really like to include these types of exercises in presentations that get you involved in doing practice risk assessments. So I'm sharing an image with you on the screen. And what I would like is for everyone in attendance to take a look at this picture and sort of think about what you might see as a potential problem, evaluating the risk for this situation. And so I'm going to pause for just a moment, and this also gives me an opportunity to get a drink of water really quickly, but I want you to take a look and see what risks you're identifying and drop those into the chat box. And we'll see if maybe you're picking up on something that even I haven't noticed before, or something that is blatantly obvious to everyone as a risk. So I'm going to pause for just a minute and give you a chance to put those different risks that you're identifying into the chat box. And I see a few things coming through. Oh yeah, now I see a lot more. Okay, so the AC could be, yeah, the AC, the window unit could be easy to pull out and then someone could gain access through the window. Vandalism and theft. It does look to me that this area might be a back entryway that's unmonitored and may be sort of an easy target for vandalism or theft. And there also looks like there's some graffiti on the wall. So a lot of people are noticing that the that AC unit could easily be pulled out and be a point of entry. Oh, poor drainage spout. Oh, that's a really really good observation that Jordan is making is that that drainage spout is draining along the building. So you have moisture being retained along the building, which actually we'll see an example of that again later on. And Morgan had pointed that out too. Duct tape. I see Jordan pointing out duct tape. Yeah, duct tape. Yikes, exactly. So not the most controlled looking situation. And antenna access to the roof. Yeah, there's a ladder that goes up to the roof there, and it doesn't look like it's blocked off in any meaningful way. So someone could definitely gain access to the building roof, and who knows from there, they might be able to get into the building proper. Pore seals on windows could lead to pests. Oh yes, Danielle, that's a great point too. Pore seals definitely can lead to pest entry, bugs, insects, mice, you name it. They can find a way in. There's a trip hazard at the door. Yep, there's really no signage and looks like a concrete brick and a mat. There's a trip hazard. And if you were carrying collections items, if this were theoretically like a collecting institution and you tripped and dropped something, that would not be a great scenario. Let's see, the building looks like it could be shared by multiple businesses. You never know what gravity might bring via a poor ceiling. That's true. So it could be like a shared office space. And who really knows on upper floors what the situation is. You might have collections stored under pipes or a restroom. Yeah, there is an empty bleach bottle at the bottom of that drain spout. I think Kelly's pointing that out. That's unusual. And it's debris, so it sort of gives the impression that no one's really monitoring this area. No lights or cameras, Tim has pointed out, and that's also true. So you don't have any monitoring or lights or any sort of security measures in place. Missing bricks near the pipes. Yep, there could be some structural issues with this building. And the wood above the door looks like a rotting, like a temporary solution. Yeah, it does look a bit like a temporary solution. Maybe some problems that were addressed hastily and not properly, which can then lead to other issues later on. And so structurally, maybe the building isn't in the best condition, but I think you've all pointed out some really good things that I actually haven't seen other people point out when I've shown this slide to them. So you're really sort of getting into the nitty gritty of all the different things to be aware of. And being able to sort of take a step back and look at your own building with that critical eye is an important part of risk assessment. So I think you've actually all done a really excellent job with this. So thank you for your input there. So I will progress to the next slide. So what you might have the most control over are the hazards and risk in your building. So if we pay close attention to these, and some of these are not inherent risks of disaster, but they can affect the severity of the disaster and also the recovery efforts. So some of these threats include things that are dangerous for individuals rather than the institutions at large, like asbestos and lead. If a disaster releases highly toxic substances, don't clean them up yourselves. I'll put emphasis on that. In the US, the collection areas and materials contaminated with toxic substances will be in the hands of hazardous material trained firefighters or certified abatement workers. With things like asbestos, if it's friable, the fibers could be inhaled and cause permanent damage to the lungs. And sources of asbestos can include older ceiling tiles, acoustic board and tile, old wall board, plaster and spackle, vinyl floor tiles. So there are a lot of things to consider. And lead is also pretty common, especially in older buildings. And heated lead in a burning paint can be aerosolized and absorbed directly into the bloodstream through the lungs. And after a fire, it can be present in dust and debris that would be on site. And some other sources for lead fumes in fires include lead shot and bullets, toy soldiers, lead from skylights or stained glass windows, and lead X-ray room insulation. And water damage can also cause lead paint to deteriorate into a powdery and flaky material. PCBs, or polychlorinated biphenyls, were widely used prior to 1979 and can be found in old paint, ceiling tiles, transformers, fluorescent light ballasts, and plastic. PCBs are carcinogenic and cause many other health problems. So it's obviously good to be aware if your building contains these materials in general, but it actually becomes even more crucial when dealing with a disaster situation. And the image on screen here is from actually a very recent fire disaster at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. This was from April of 2021. And you'll see that a wildfire that had started on, I believe it was South Africa's Table Mountain, destroyed, among others, the University of Cape Town's campus. It ravaged its historic library that housed a priceless African studies collection that has been described as very unique in the world. The fire detection system did trigger fire doors, which presumably saved many of the most precious records stored at the library's lower levels. But the floor that was raised by those flames also held vast collections of literature and records that are now presumably lost. So fire detection and fire suppression are not designed to solve all of your problems, but they are designed to give fire departments enough time to arrive on site and solve the problem before the fire becomes completely unmanageable. And this is really our nightmare scenario, as fire is one of the biggest risks to collections. We have buildings that are actually just full of tinder, and catastrophic loss can happen very, very quickly. Because of this, we take fire risk very seriously. And that being said, it's important to recognize that none of us here are probably, though I'm assuming, experts on fire prevention and detection. And we shouldn't really be making decisions without the guidance of trained fire prevention specialists. So we're going to consider the next few slides that are coming up as background information to aid you in your collaboration with a fire prevention specialist. So it's hard to do an assessment of risks related to fire without knowing what methods of detection and protection you already have in place. And there are a lot of different kinds of detectors and methods of detection, but I've narrowed down the list here to a few types, and we'll walk through and explain what each of them are. There's a tiny bit of overlap between them, and you'll see that. But before we get into them, I want to explain our objective in detection. It should be to detect as early as possible with as few false positives as possible so that you can get out of the building and the fire department can respond as quickly as possible. So those last two about you getting out of the building and the fire department responding are contingent on a good signaling system, which is going to be what we talk about in the next slide. But you can't signal a fire without detecting it first, which is where these come in. So the one that we've all heard of is a smoke detector, but there's a lot of kinds. And the most common detectors are called spot type. ionization, and photoelectric detectors. So spot type are the kind you see at home that look like little discs on the ceiling. They can be ionization type smoke detectors, which pick up ionized particles in the air as a result of a fire. They're considered best for fires that transition into a flaming fire quickly, so fast flaming fires. They can also be photoelectric smoke detectors, which pick up visible smoke particles. These are considered best for fires that persist in the smoldering stage for a long period of time. And a lot of organizations like National Fire Protection Association recommend having both because it's hard to predict what type of fire you'll actually have. And a specialist might recommend strategic placements of each within your building. They may also recommend a combination detector that has both in the same spot type detector. You can also find line type or optical beam photoelectric detectors. And these are still picking up visible smoke, but they can do it over a very large area and with very high ceilings. They're helpful in tall buildings, such as warehouses, and some repositories may have collections in large warehouse-like spaces that put these to use. Since they cover more area, they can be more economical in large spaces than a spot type detector. And another kind you might find are aspirating smoke detectors. And these use discrete little ducts in your building to pull air in other words, aspirate the air to a central room with a sensor that then analyzes the air for signs of fire. And this is often recommended for places with high value materials in which the fastest response possible is really paramount. But they might also include places in which the aesthetic qualities of the space are really critical, such as in a historic home, because the ducts are a little bit more discreet than a spot type detector. And two others worth mentioning are flame detectors that detect the flame itself using a line of sight, and heat detectors that pick up an increase in heat within a space. And these aren't as common in cultural heritage spaces, but I want to mention them so that you're not lost if someone else were to mention them. Sometimes it's just good to know the lingo and what exactly you're talking about or what someone else is talking about. But the bottom line is that even when you narrow down the many options, there's a lot of thinking that will actually go into placement. And we strongly recommend using the vocabulary here to speak with a professional, but this list should help you to determine what you have and know what to talk about with a specialist. So again, it's really good to just go into the situation having a general baseline of knowledge, but also the vocabulary. But you also have an alarm system to consider. And this may be linked to manual fire pulls like your sprinklers or your smoke detectors. But one way to classify your alarm system is by who the alarm actually goes to. And here are 4 common types. The first is protected premises. This is to get occupants out of the building. And this is important, but it usually isn't enough when we've got collections in a space 24/7. So we need to consider some other options. There's auxiliary alarms go to your fire department, and some municipalities have this option and some don't. Central station goes to a business that monitors 24/7 and is qualified to notify the fire department. And proprietary is like central station above, but the station is owned by the property that's actually being protected. So you can think of this like a college campus that has its own station that's fully monitored. Most of us are probably going to have a local alert to occupants, but it's important to also have a link to someone who is monitoring 24/7. And then fire suppression. This is one that a lot of people talk about. So we also have to think about our fire suppression systems. And the lack of a fire suppression system is what unites many cultural heritage facilities that burn down completely. And I really can't emphasize that enough. If you don't have a suppression system, you should be exploring every single other fire prevention strategy possible, because you're likely going to experience great loss if a fire were to occur in your building. And if it's at all possible to plan for the long-term acquisition of a suppression system, that is really going to be critical and ideal. There are grants that can help you with funding, including the National Endowment for the Humanities Infrastructure and Capacity Building Challenge Grant. So that's something to consider. And I believe I have a link to that I can share with you in the chat. So if you have a sprinkler system, be very glad that you have it. You'd rather be saving soggy papers instead of picking up the ashes of your local history materials. The amount of water emitted by a sprinkler is less than the hose of a firefighter, and only the sprinklers above the fire go off. If there's a fire, an automatic suppression system is one way to make sure your collections actually get less wet than if you let the fire department handle it without one. So these are the ones that we at NEDCC get asked about the most, and the first three are the most common. So first is a wet pipe system. It has water in it at all times. If you're in an area that's prone to freezing, this can sometimes cause problems. Freezing can block the flow of water in an emergency, for instance, or you may be dealing with burst pipes. A dry pipe system has pipes that are filled with pressurized air or nitrogen rather than water. And this air holds a remote valve known as a dry pipe valve in a closed position. When a fire occurs and generates enough heat to release the sprinklers, the air escapes and the dry pipe valve releases. Water then enters the pipe, flowing through open sprinklers onto a fire. And this can be good in locations where the piping would be exposed to temperatures below 40 degrees Fahrenheit. And then we have pre-action systems. They operate very similarly to dry pipe systems, but they have an electrically operated valve known as a pre-action valve. And this valve will only release when triggered by independent flame, heat, or smoke detection, which helps to prevent accidental activation. Then you have clean agent or gaseous systems, and those are a little less common. These release gases to displace oxygen around a fire and won't damage collections. But it's very important for people to evacuate the area as they can pose health risks. And a few examples of those would be Energen or halon, which is no longer produced, and CO2 systems, and those pose hazards to people. And lastly, there's the fine water mist system that releases water vapor. In theory, it will get your collections the least wet, but in a talk by J. Andrew Wilson, Assistant Director of Fire Protection and Safety at the Smithsonian, he expresses caution about this option. There are limited studies on how fine water mist works for cultural heritage repositories. And Wilson's, a talk that he gave was last reviewed in 2016, and research has likely continued since then, but it suggests that fine water systems aren't really a silver bullet for our community, and study always needs to precede adoption of a new strategy. So something to consider. But these are the options that you will probably hear the most about. And I have another link that I can share with you about fire prevention. You'll get a lot of links. And then lastly, we have to think about portable extinguishers. And there are different types of fires, like type A, trash, wood, paper fires, B, flammable liquid fires, and C, electrical fires, with different classes of extinguishers for each of these. And you want to have the type of extinguisher that handles them all, which is an ABC dry chemical extinguisher. Outside of knowing what you have, I recommend making sure you know where they all are and that they're regularly inspected. Also, being trained to use them is a very important thing, and can be part of just your overall training for disaster preparedness. I believe sometimes local fire departments will schedule training for how to use the portable extinguishers. So much of your building maintenance relies on regular inspection, and you want to make sure to establish a schedule to inspect the areas that I have listed here on screen, from electrical, HVAC, plumbing, masonry, and fire suppression. Look for things like daisy chains, which I'm not sure if everyone's familiar with that term, but that's sort of when you're using one surge protector tied into another. You can also look for things like crumbling plaster, or maybe tide lines on ceiling tiles, old leak protection activities, garbage and food containers that might not be emptied regularly, and insect or animal carcasses, which can indicate a problem or might also cause a problem, as those insect carcasses lying around provide a protein source for other insects. We want to see preventive maintenance at our institutions rather than just crisis-based maintenance. And I also actually really highly recommend that you develop an on-site log of problems. This is going to really help evaluating your risks over time. You'll see where problems have continued to occur, and that will help in decision making, or also making a case to maybe move collections if they're in an area that experiences leaks again and again. So I really do think that's a great thing to establish, is an on-site log of problems. And it's also important to remember that once you fix a problem, you'll want to actually clean it up so that you know it was fixed, or that the person coming along behind you knows that the problem has been addressed. The old tide lines that you see on these ceiling tiles could actually hide new ones and a new problem that's developing. So when there's a leak, change out the tiles, just so you can detect future leaks too. And our risk evaluation continues in the aftermath of disasters. We talked about secondary disasters earlier, and we want to watch for things like a humidity spike following a water leak, since that could cause mold or a pest infestation. And in the picture to the left here, you'll see a red arrow that's pointing to what looks like a plastic covering or a ceiling tile that's actually, it's full of water, and I'm sure that in this scenario, it would burst soon if left unattended, but the buckets, the plastic buckets that you see there on the floor, they're probably not going to catch all of the water when that finally gives way. And then you have to deal with not only your flooring getting wet, but potentially backsplash onto your items that are sitting on the shelves. So even after the disaster has passed, are there new risks to consider? And oftentimes there probably are some things to consider. And so with that, we're actually going to do another risk assessment. I am going to change my slide so that you can see the image that we're going to look at. It's a little more involved in some ways than the first practice risk assessment that we did. So I'll set the scene. This is a temporary storage space for a museum undergoing renovations. And this is actually a real scenario, but I feel okay picking this apart since their storage space no longer looks like this. So they've cleaned it up, but you don't need much additional context to start assessing this. But what I will say is let's just put it into, let's put it locally. So since we're being hosted by a Missouri institution, let's say that this storage space within this institution is located in central Missouri. So taking that into consideration, take a look at this image and what do you think could be some risks here? And as we did before, I'll take a pause. This allows me to get some water and rest my voice for a moment, but also for you to take a look, evaluate, and then put some ideas into the chat box. And you can take that contextual information about this might be located in central Missouri into consideration with any sort of regional things that might cause a risk. Okay, we have some good input coming through. Let's see. So Alan has said there are a lot of exposed items that would be damaged if water were to come from above. So yeah, we do see some piping above. Not sure if that's a fire suppression or just piping in general. So that's something to take into consideration. Unfinished concrete, humidity issues from NB. Yeah, that's a good point, actually. You know, it's hard to tell from the image, but that wall here that I'm pointing to could be an exterior wall, and you don't want to store things along an exterior wall just because of temperature fluctuation or moisture. So that's something to take into consideration too. Exposed items. Let's see. Yeah, I think we talked about that. And poorly lit, so it's hard to spot potential problems early. And yeah, it does look dark in there. It looks cavernous toward the back. So it is hard to just take a glance and see some of the issues that could be hiding in that far back corner. I'm sure there are quite a few. No apparent wayfinding in an emergency. How will people evacuate safely? And Kelly makes a good point. If you are in this area during an emergency and you needed to evacuate quickly, you also just run the risk of tripping on things and injuring yourself and knocking things over, or just figuring out where exactly you should go to exit. I don't see like an exit sign pointing anyone to an emergency exit. Lots of cardboard and crowding, which could lead to pest issues, Morgan pointed out, and that's very true. There's a lot of crowding. It's clutter, probably dusty, cardboard of unidentified archival quality, just sort of sitting around. And yes, I think that all of these things would probably attract pests. Don't see much in the way of ventilation. That's also a good point to make. Not sure if we have climate control in this area or any type of ventilation. Maybe, maybe not, but I don't see any sort of data loggers hidden anywhere to monitor the situation. And Erica mentioned items are stored on the ground, which is definitely something we always want to be thinking about, is if items are on the ground and there were to be a flood scenario, those items are going to get wet. And if they were just raised off the ground 4 to 6 inches, or if they were on pallets, you may avoid having to salvage wet materials. So those are all definitely good things to point out. And it's a pretty complex situation here. I don't see a fire extinguisher. Items are unevenly stacked. Some of those boxes are even open. Some of these are covered by plastic sheeting for like a moving the collection to a temporary storage space. And we don't want to leave that sort of stuff on items long term, especially if it's not an archival plastic. So good job. Just exercising those risk assessment skills. And I just tend to think these pictures are fun to look at and pick apart. Okay, so continuing our preventive maintenance, landscaping is also a big thing for public buildings, but oftentimes people like to make these outside areas look really beautiful without thinking about how they impact the inside of the building as well. And this doesn't necessarily mean that you need to get rid of all of your landscaping and plants, but being thoughtful about their placement can actually be really important. And many university agricultural extension services recommend leaving a foot of open space around the foundation of buildings to prevent moisture buildup that can lead to mold and damaging dampness. And depending on the region you're in, which most of you will be in Missouri, you may have other considerations, especially where wildfires take place, like maintaining defensible space to consider. And that's something that libraries within my region would be taking into consideration. It's really good to involve landscaping staff or volunteers in the risk assessment and maintenance conversations, just as we would with facilities. And university extension offices focus on agricultural best practices for farmers in particular, but typically they also provide outreach and education for other like gardeners, including homeowners and businesses. So those can actually be good sources of research-based information for landscaping. And in this picture here, I will point out things like we're not sure if there's a really great seal that would block out water, or like a door sweep that would keep insects from coming in. But also you have leaves and debris piling up. They can maybe even at some point, if not cleaned, clog the drain and then lead to a water buildup if there were heavy rains. And thinking about if that basement area would have a sump pump, for example. And of course, thinking about your roofs, gutters, and eaves, and having all of these things regularly maintained. And I told you we'd see these downspouts again. So having downspouts is great, but they need to be properly installed and maintained. And these two photos that you see on the screen are of the same building, and you can see either side of the front door in the different images. The one on the right deposits water against the building's foundation, as it doesn't have a proper extension. And that's an issue that we saw in that first practice risk assessment that we did, that someone actually pointed that out, that that was an issue. And you can see some water staining along the wall there. And there's actually some mildew under the portico. On the left, the downspout is extended away from the building, which is good, but it ends where the mulch ends, and the grass begins. So that can potentially cause some erosion. And the grading actually changes at that point, so the water is no longer draining quite as smoothly. The extension is also not fully buried, which leaves it at a higher risk of damage and cracks over time. And so now we'll shift gears just a bit and talk about the risks within collections. So certain materials within our collections may also be more inherently hazardous than others. And it's important to identify if you have any of the materials that are listed on this slide. And those would be things like cellulose nitrate, stuffed or jarred natural history specimens, or ordnance or ammo. And sometimes those do crop up in collections. So here are some examples of things in collections that are innately hazardous, including this interesting chicken specimen. Arsenic and mercury are really common in older natural history collections. Things like taxidermy and pressed botanical specimens were treated with these to help prevent pests. They can cause issues during day-to-day handling, obviously, as well as during a disaster scenario. You may also have deactivated or unexploded munitions in your collections. So that's something to be cognizant of. And the notorious nitrate film, which is incredibly flammable. The film that you see on screen here is so very deteriorated that it's time to really just dispose of it, properly, of course. But nitrate in good condition should still be kept cold in cold storage, and you should know that it's there and review your insurance coverage and local regulations for storage. I will also add that if you have nitrate film in your collection, it doesn't hurt to let the local fire department know that you have it and where it's located in your building. And keep an eye out for old plastics as well. These can actually be very flammable too and can release harmful gases in a fire. And I will mention that the Getty Institute actually does a lot of research in this area. And I have a good link that I can share with you that will give you some more information on harmful plastics and their makeup. Because sometimes people are surprised to hear that these plastics can actually be harmful. But I think that a lot of them are composed of cellulose acetate. And old medicinal items may not actually be common in everyone's institution, but I want to make sure that we're covering all of our bases here and going through everything. So in the early 20th century up through World War II, it was common for gauze bandages in first aid kits to be soaked with a liquid called picric acid, a hazardous material and a forerunner of TNT. And the pads, which were packed into many commercial first aid kits, were intended to be used mostly to treat burns. And picric acid is normally a liquid, but as it dries out, it sort of crystallizes into an unstable compound with a distinctive yellow residue. And if you have any first aid kits from about 1945 or earlier in your collections, maybe in your garage or shed, or you think you might have picric acid, which is no longer as readily available as it once was, that's the situation where you would call the fire department just to have it checked out. And sometimes local history museums might have some of these types of things in their collection. So yet again, just something to be aware of. And since we've gone through all different types of threats and hazardous materials to look out for, and we've performed a couple of mini risk assessments ourselves, we're going to briefly walk through a few tools that you can use to conduct a risk assessment at your own institution. And I will say again that these documents are that I'm going to share with you are available in the publicly shared folder. And just for the sake of covering all of our bases, I'm going to share that link in the chat again, just to give you another opportunity to grab it if you haven't before. So here are some of the tools that we recommend using. We won't spend time covering all of these in depth, but I do want to briefly touch on how you can use these to your advantage. And we'll start with a couple that are good for those really large scale geographical risks. And so the first one here, the FEMA flood map, it's really easy to use and provides information on different areas of risk, such as area of minimal flood hazard or area with flood risk due to levee. So having this type of information will help you to rank your risk of flooding where your institution is located. You can also look at the disaster declarations by year for your region on FEMA's website. And that's the second resource that you'll see. Looking at past years will help you to put together a longer history of disasters for your region. And the Foundation for Advancement in Conservation, called FAIC, has a risk evaluation and planning program with some really great resources too. Their walkthrough checklist is included in that shared folder of documents, and it's pretty comprehensive and helps you to go through your physical space and evaluate hazards, as well as taking a look at your institutional policies and staff training as they relate to emergency preparedness. And I tend to really like checklists in general, so I think that this tool is really easy to use and gives you a lot of information to work with. And there's also a probability impact chart, and that's going to be in your folder. Once you've created a list of your potential threats, identify which of these threats would have the greatest impact on your institution. You can create a chart that maps the probability of each threat occurring and its effect on your institution. And this prioritization is important because, as I said earlier, you can't be prepared for everything. You have to determine which risks pose the greatest threat to your institution and focus on these. This chart is an easy way to start determining your priorities by mapping the probability of each threat occurring alongside its effect on your institution. And then we have a heritage preservation worksheet. So this is a more robust tool that identifies different types of disasters to look out for and calculates an overall risk rating based on the likelihood of occurrence multiplied by the severity of damage. Having more concrete numbers and ratings can be helpful for insurance purposes specifically, and really kind of handy to show your administration when discussing possible risks. And there's another tool listed at the bottom here, and that's the University of California's Library Collections Risk Assessment Tool. I won't talk too much about that in depth, but it's just one more resource that you're going to have in that publicly shared folder. So you'll have a lot of different things to start your risk assessment journey. And I really think that you'll find all of these things particularly useful and informative too. So actually, I've built in like a 5-minute break for us so that we can all have a little bit of a breather. Because once you go kind of beyond that 2-hour mark of a workshop or a webinar, I feel like everyone needs a little bit of a breather. And we're coming up right on, we're coming along right on schedule, I will say. So let's say that we will take a 5-minute break. And that's going to put us coming back at, let's see, I'm having to do a little time zone math here since I'm in Pacific time. So it is 3:28 where you are, 3:35. So we will come back at 3:35. Yes, okay. So we're going to come back at 3:35. And I'm actually going to put that in the chat box here. We will come back from a 5-minute break at 3:35, but please do stay connected to the Zoom session. Just make sure that you're muted and cameras off. So a small break for everyone. Okay. See, by my clock, we're at 3:35 Central. So we should be ready to jump back in. And hopefully you can still hear me. Just checking. Okay, Bethany can hear me. Thank you, Bethany. I appreciate that. Sometimes when you do these kinds of courses remotely, it feels like you're talking to yourself a little bit for a while, which can be odd. However, I appreciate you chiming in to letting me know. I'm not alone. Okay, so we are jumping into emergency preparedness. So we're starting with the steps of emergency management, and we're going to cover the planning, roles, and supplies needed to support your institution. And I'll introduce each consideration as we go through the cycle. So here's just a visual reminder of the emergency management cycle. And I'd like to mention that everything we've talked about is really circular and ongoing, and that includes our preparedness efforts. When you inevitably go through some sort of disaster, whether it's large or small, you can use your response and recovery experience to make your mitigation practices better. And mitigation is itself the cornerstone of emergency management. It's the continuing effort to lessen the impact disasters have on people and property. Through effective mitigation practices, we can ensure that we lessen our chances of having to respond to a disaster. Mitigation practices include water deterrence, fire safety and prevention, mold prevention, and pest management. Preparedness takes the form of plans and procedures designed to save lives and to minimize damage when an emergency occurs. Planning, training, and disaster drills are the essential elements of preparedness. And these activities ensure that when a disaster strikes, emergency managers will be able to provide the best response possible. In an emergency, the best protection is really knowing what to do. And response is defined as the actions taken to save lives and prevent further damage in a disaster or emergency situation. Response is putting preparedness plans into action. And response activities may include initiating your disaster plan, search and rescue, and damage assessment. Recovery is defined as the actions taken to return the community to normal following a disaster. Repairing, replacing, or rebuilding property are all examples of recovery. And if you'll remember that we started with risk assessment because it is the foundation of the first phase of emergency management. And when we discussed some risk assessment tools just prior to the break, we mentioned a probability impact chart. And actually, you'll see that now on the screen. Here it is. So to review, in the process of risk management, we identify possible hazards, both natural and man-made. We identify the vulnerability of our collections and the impact that a disaster of a particular nature would have on them. If a threat is deemed to be both very likely and very impactful, we should prioritize it for preparation, which means making sure you have a good plan and you practice it. And mitigation is really strengthened by monitoring strategies. Your risk assessment will be your guide to specific areas to focus on. In general, this means having in place means to monitor for temperature, relative humidity, pests, if that's a priority, water, and fire. Things like data loggers do a great job tracking temperature and relative humidity. and water detectors that can be purchased from places like retailers like Home Depot that send you text messages if there's water buildup. Those are good too. Make sure you don't get water detectors that just ring an alarm locally though, because if it happens overnight, you're not going to hear it. When we do have access to buildings, nothing beats a physical walkthrough of a space. Just a simple walkthrough in your storage space should happen daily, ideally. A more serious, careful walkthrough should happen once every 6 months and before and after serious weather events or disasters. We also work with facility staff to schedule preventive maintenance, and 4 top priorities will be your roof, fire detection and suppression systems, and lastly, your HVAC. Those are going to be the big 4. Then keep in mind your storage practices. And just as when we looked at the slide for our last risk assessment, think about things like, are your collections off the ground? Are they in boxes and enclosures that are just going to provide another layer of protection? And moving away from mitigation now, we're going to pivot to preparedness. And I will say a trained staff armed with emergency procedures is the best preparation for a chaotic situation. There's going to be the focus of the that's going to kind of be the focus of the later part of today's session. So we'll be talking a lot about disaster plans. And training is an activity that you can conduct with your disaster plan. Once you get your plan put together, you need to familiarize your staff with it. So having regular training sessions, good relationships with your local emergency responders, all of that outreach and communication is part of the preparedness phase. Training your staff in how to prepare for and respond to emergencies accomplishes 2 things. First, your staff is well versed in your disaster plan, so they're going to feel more confident and well armed with the tool that they understand. And second, it can expose weaknesses in your plan, like maybe missing information or a policy that just doesn't make sense. 3 major topics of training that we focus on are safety, including evacuations and basic first aid, facilities, meaning how to secure the building and shut off systems, how to work the alarm and things of that nature, and collections, including salvage priorities and early stabilization steps. The disaster response team that you put together should establish you should establish that prior to a disaster. A disaster response team does not necessarily have to follow your organization structure. So for instance, your director does not have to be the leader of your disaster response team. Maybe someone else on staff has an interest or skill set that would make them a great candidate for one of the spots on that team. So if they have the skills, they have the interest, empower them to act. And there are many methods for trainings, which can include different learning and teaching styles and different requirements from staff and from staff time. Practice scenarios get your staff familiar with making decisions under pressure, and drills make sure everyone knows the evacuation route, but they also expose issues within your system. So this is a good chance to see if your PA system only works in half of the building, for instance, or are the alarms on different floors not synced together? And then you would repeat this annually to include new staff or student workers who come on board if you're at a university library. So it's just good to make sure that you're doing these things on a regular annual basis so that everyone is involved, even if they've just recently come on board. Traditional read-throughs of the disaster plan are always a good idea, but hands-on training is the most effective method. This could take the form of hands-on wet materials salvage workshops, which you could, organize within your own institution or do through another organization that facilitates those. They can also be tabletop scenarios or a disaster plan stress test, or even the fire extinguisher training with the local fire department that I mentioned earlier. Some firsthand experience will make staff more confident and capable when it comes to responding to a real emergency. And your staff will be confident with what procedures to follow and how to react if they've practiced and they know what's going to show up or who's going to show up when they call 911. So making those types of connections before you're in a disaster scenario can put everyone at ease and make them feel a lot more prepared. So you'll see our list of activities for preparedness, and completing your actual disaster plan, of course, is at the top of the list. And then doing some trainings and demonstrations and evacuation drills. Again, doing a walkthrough of your building is part of your preparedness. And we talked a bit about building maintenance earlier, but also remember to take a good look at your fire escapes and emergency exits, your windows and doors, and just make sure that there aren't any dangerous situations developing. And we did see a good example of some windows and doors that may not be up to par in that first risk assessment that we did. Having some emergency supplies on hand with staff who knows how to use them is a really key part of preparedness too. And we're going to sort of look at a few examples of some emergency response kits, but there's also a list of recommended kit supplies that's going to be in the shared folder. So those are all of our steps for the preparedness stage. And I will also tack on that examining your fire extinguishers, making sure that they're regularly updated, like you see in the picture here, is a great idea. And it also helps to remember sometimes that maybe, your first responders who don't get to work with collections materials regularly like we do, they might be really excited to, do a walkthrough of the building, see the collections, and know that they're actually, taking part in helping to protect those collections. And then moving on to response and recovery. And remember, preparedness is really all about front loading your decision making. I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. And as I mentioned earlier, response refers to the immediate activity aimed at addressing threats to people and stabilizing the emergency. Recovery is the ongoing activity that returns an organization and its collections to normal. And depending on the emergency, these can overlap and recovery can take a very long time. Your response actions will be guided by your disaster plan. And the first thing to prioritize in any dangerous situation is really going to be your own personal safety and the safety of other staff of the institution. Secondly, always heed to any first responder or police needs. Depending on the situation, they will often be the first people on the scene, and you may have to wait for permission to enter your building. So it helps to be prepared in the situation to take orders and really be patient. But your priorities should be personal safety, property stabilization, and collections and preservation. But I feel like you always have those people that feel like they just need to rush in and start grabbing collections. But really, you want to pull back a little bit and think about your own safety and making sure that it's safe to enter the building. And we can think of response in 3 phases, that being assessment, review, and planning. And the first thing that you're going to do is assess the situation and get a handle on what exactly you're dealing with. Depending on what the emergency is, you'll have different approaches to handling the situation, and this influences the way that you use your plan. For example, if you come across a leaky window while you're locking up for the night, you don't necessarily need to call 911 or contact your whole disaster team. But if the fire marshal calls you in the middle of the night, it's an all hands on deck scenario. Similarly, if you have a sick patron, you might refer to your plan for some quick guidance without making too big of a scene about it and call someone for assistance. But if you have an intruder or even an active shooter situation, you need to remove yourself from the area and let the authorities handle it. So think about any immediate risks, then consider who might be affected. Who's in the building with you, who's outside the building, like administrators or insurance companies who might need to know what's going on. And the next step is to review your disaster planning. And this isn't about reading it from cover to cover, because you're already going to know its outline and general contents fairly well. So consider, where are you going to coordinate your response? How will you ensure the safety of staff and volunteers at your institution? Who do you need to contact? Do you have existing contacts in place, like a salvage vendor, someone like a Belfour or one of the big national vendors? And if so, do you have an existing contract in place with them? And do you know where they are and what they say in terms of the contract? Do you have an account number that you can refer to for those contracts or for your insurance even? That's a lot to think about in an emergency situation, but you want to remain calm and use the disaster plan as your guide. And it's also listed here on the slide, but I will make a special mention that while the disaster plan will have contact information, you also would probably benefit from having things like what we call a panic sheet, which would usually be like one sheet with all of your immediate contacts in the event of disaster, or like a phone tree for contacts. So it helps to have that information laid out in a very easily digestible, quick in the moment sort of way to pull it up and utilize it without having to think too much about it or flip through too many pages. So having those sorts of flip charts for quick reference and phone trees for contacts is a really helpful thing too. And we've looked at some of these steps before, but this version is a bit more detailed for response. And the way we have them arranged is really to help understand the different response actions. But of course, we know that in the heat of the moment, things might not come together so nicely, but that's okay. You might have one person checking emergency supplies while another person is working with neighboring institutions, while others are vacuuming books, perhaps. The idea here is just to understand that there are multiple responsibilities in an emergency situation, and you get to each part as well as you can. And as you start reacting to the situation, you'll be making decisions that affect both your short and long-term recovery. Contacting the fire department, calling the insurance company, laying out absorbent pads for a spill. These are all immediate short-term steps. Getting your backup server running so you have email access might be a little bit slower. Completing conservation treatment on damaged materials or installing new fire alarms. These might be even further down the road. But it's important to keep communicating with your team and documenting your decisions as you begin to implement your response actions. And of course, these steps get bigger and larger the bigger the disaster is. And your disaster plan will include decisions about what your priority collections are. Your recovery activities should start with these, and you can have specific actions or methods described in your disaster plan too. A lot of this will have to do with how much wet or damaged material you have and what value it is to you. If you decide that you can't just dispose of a whole bunch of wet books and get new volumes, then you begin to consider your different drying and repair methods. But it's important to balance what can be done in-house versus what needs to be sent out to a professional. It can honestly be very difficult to do in-house salvage, and you need to be realistic about the time, space, and resources that you have on hand, including staffing, and how these balance with other institutional disaster recovery efforts. In general, if you have about 100 wet books or less, you can take care of that in-house. Same thing with 100 photos or less. You could probably manage that in-house. But with larger quantities, you'll want to work with an outside disaster recovery vendor. And you all have access to a list of national response resources in the PDF of the slides that's going to be in the shared folder, but those slides will also be coming up later, so you'll have a chance to see exactly who I'm talking about, if you don't already know. And you'll want to think about recovery options when you make your plan. And of course, I recommend having some additional resources on hand too, such as the WAAC Salvage at a Glance handout. That's also going to be included in your folder, but it's a quick, easy to use on-site tool that you can refer to during an emergency to make the best decisions for materials. But if, say, you know that you have a lot of audiovisual materials in your collection that would require outside help to salvage, or other materials that require some sort of special attention, you'll want to make note of that because it's really going to affect your planning as well. And I know a lot of times you talk about freezing items and being able to make decisions about them later, but it's important to remember that freezing is not appropriate for every format. And that chart, the Salvage at a Glance chart, actually will tell you when things may not be suitable for that type of freezing. So it's a really helpful tool, and I actually have it saved on the desktop of my computer for when I staff the emergency hotline for NEDCC. Okay, so we're still pretty much on time, and I would like for us to have a chance to have a little bit of a breakout discussion. So this is where I get to practice, successfully or unsuccessfully, the breakout rooms. We'll see how it goes. So I think what we're going to try to do, and Jamie can correct me if I'm abysmally wrong, is try to automatically assign you to some breakout rooms, which means that you're going to get an option to join a breakout room that will look hopefully similar to this if all goes well. But what are we going to talk about in our breakout rooms? Well, what I'd like for you to talk about is disaster planning at your own institution. So it's a time for a little self-reflection and sharing before we launch into recommendations for your disaster plan, and some things that we'll discuss. And I will say that it's a safe space to discuss these things. There's no judgment here. we're going to talk about disaster planning at your institution, if you're at one, or maybe one that you've been at in the past. And you'll think about things like, does your institution have a disaster plan? And if so, does it take collections into consideration? Is it a written plan? What style is it in? Is it large format, flip chart? Maybe it's one sheet. Do you think that it prepares you appropriately for a disaster? So that's a lot of things to talk about. I think we're going to take about 10 minutes, to do this. You can feel free to kind of introduce yourself in the breakout room, because theoretically speaking, I guess you'll be in there with people that you've never met before. But these are the questions that I've mentioned. So let's see how it goes. So I'm going to look for breakout rooms, and I guess I'm going to narrate my thought process to you as well. That could be entertaining.
Do you want me to push the button to create them?
Yeah.
How many do you want? I can do 2 to 4, I think.
Since there are quite a few people here, I think having 4 would be okay. A smaller group discussion.
There will be 5 to 6 participants per room.
Oh, that sounds good. Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay, so I'm gonna push the button. Let's see if it works.
Okay, let's see. But I'm not going to join the room. But I think everyone else might have.
Yeah, everybody should have gotten a pop-up to click to join.
And I've seen options to share slides with people in breakout rooms before, but I don't now.
So on the bottom, the slide should still be up, I believe. You can also broadcast a message to everyone.
I'm going to broadcast. I know there might be a bit of a character limit, but let's see. I'll broadcast that one. And going to be poor grammatically, but they'll get the gist.
Yeah, and you can join any of the rooms.
Okay.
If you wanted to jump in.
I might just let them simmer for a minute and then come back out and see if anyone wants to share. You set this on a timer?
No, I think I can, but I didn't see an option for it.
Okay. We're going to pull them back in about roughly 10 minutes.
Okay.
Okay.
So what I'll do is I'll broadcast a message when about a minute, like at 4:10, saying that I'm going to exit all the rooms.
Okay. That sounds good. Yeah. I'm just not that accustomed to actually running breakout rooms myself, so it's given me a little bit of anxiety.
Yeah, we don't use Zoom. We use WebEx for most of our stuff, and it's like slightly different. And I've only ever done it on those ones.
Okay.
So I'm gonna try joining a room.
Okay.
And then I'll be back.
All right.
Annie, are you still there?
I am.
Okay, do you want me to do a message saying like 3-minute warning?
Let's do a 1-minute warning just to keep us on time.
Okay. I got really nervous when I was leaving the room because right above it was end meeting for all. And I was really hoping it didn't misclick it.
Oh my goodness. That would definitely be the kind of pop-up that sent shivers down my spine.
Yep.
Oh, there's so many things to worry about in these situations.
Yeah.
But thank you for helping with the breakout room. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna end it after I send this next meeting, or after I send this next message.
Okay. It's nice to give everyone a chance to
Oh my
sign
gosh, there's
off.
a minute warning when you close them. Oh, no. That's funny.
It's fine. It's fine. Some people may pop back in anyway. I think they have the ability to just join the main room.
Yeah, I think so.
There we go. I see people coming back. Okay. That's awesome. I really appreciate everyone being a good sport and participating in the breakout room. Sometimes when I go into breakout rooms, I personally feel a little bit awkward, but do we have everyone back yet? Oh, good, Bethany. Got to meet new people. And that's part of the process. Meet new people, and sometimes just to know that, your institution, if you're paranoid that you're not as far along as you should be, it helps to see that a lot of other places aren't either. And I've from doing these types of trainings and being a co-teacher, I found that a lot of places, they don't know where to start. And sometimes it's helpful to know that other people don't know where to start either. Okay, is everyone back at this point? Have we fulfilled our 1 minute?
I think so. I don't have a breakout.
Okay, so everyone should be back now, and now I'm just talking to myself about nothing. Okay, well, thank you all for being good sports and participating in the breakout room. We have about 2 minutes to, if someone wanted to share something about their institution, or maybe if they have a disaster plan, you could unmute yourself and maybe just give us a little idea of what you're dealing with, or if you want to put it into the chat, that's fine too. But I'm going to leave it until 4:15 to see if anyone wants to share. And if they don't, that's fine. I can always move along. No one's taking the bait, but that's totally fine. Okay, I won't make you suffer in silence. I will move along. But I'm going to mute all again just to block out any background noise before we head into our next section. Here we go, the disaster plan. So now we're going to really start digging into what a disaster plan is. And each of the topics listed here on the slide, you'll see institution, response and recovery, and supplies and services. What was I saying? Each of these topics represents sections of the plan, and you'll see that it aligns with the contents of a full disaster plan template that is going to be in the shared folder. That's the worksheet for outlining an emergency response plan. Now, it's very common for people to feel overwhelmed by their disaster plan. I have felt overwhelmed by disaster plans in the past, I will admit. Or maybe they think they can't gather the information and resources they need to complete it, but it's really not such a like big, scary thing, I promise. And at NEDCC, we like to think of the disaster plan as resource assessment. What and who do you have that will help you to respond and recover? So going through the different steps of an emergency management will produce the information that your institution needs. You can't predict every scenario, like we said before, but the plan will help you make decisions in a variety of situations. Your plan isn't a super specific set of steps. It's just the organization of resources ahead of time. So there's always room for change and expansion, and you have to remember to always be flexible. And so here are the topics we'll be exploring. And remember, this is just one example of a disaster plan. You should feel totally free to take the information we discuss in the template and move parts around or add sections. Customize it however it needs to be to better serve your collections. There really isn't a one-size-fits-all plan, so take pieces of examples that you like, mush them together, and create something custom. What I really want you to take away is the importance of succinct, well-organized information. So for your policies to be truly effective, they have to be published to staff and the disaster team. Producing a physical plan, like in a binder or a folder, creates a tangible tool that can be shared among employees. If a major disaster takes place at your institution, you can expect it to take 72 hours before you can even get into the building in most situations. So you'll want to have copies of your plan off-site as well as on-site, maybe even in a shared online cloud storage environment. Once the new plan is completed, it should be reviewed and updated annually, but triggers like new hires or changes in position or renovations to your building, those will also prompt a review of the disaster plan and contact information. You have to remember that it is a living document. And your disaster plan will probably be a binder with separate chapters and sections. So picture your binder, and these next few topics will each be like a section of that binder. So what we're going to do is sort of quickly go through each of these, and then we'll stop and talk about them all a little bit more in depth. So your plan starts with listing institutional information, general plan management, and who in your organization is actually involved in the plan. Second, you think about the services you need to rely on in an emergency. And this can range from media recovery to computer recovery, which are paid services, to things like the police or the sheriff or fire department. Next comes your supplies. And you can probably guess some of the things that are in here, like first aid kits for life safety and things like blank newsprint for drawing collections. Facilities equipment is like your main electrical shutoff or main gas shutoff, which might need to be used in an emergency. And you might run out of supplies and equipment though, or just not carry something in-house normally, like a backup generator. So section D for additional sources of emergency equipment and supplies is going to give you an option to drop that information in. And your procedures come next, and these are preparedness, monitoring, and mitigation in sections E, F, and G. And these are already filled out for you, sort of like a checklist. You're really supposed to take E and F and just check off the boxes to show that you did them on a schedule. G is going to include more annual seasonal planning like fire drills and fire extinguisher training. And then I and J are salvage priorities and your procedures for dealing with collections. And then lastly, we have a section on the locations that you're going to use to dry collections. So now we're going to go step by step with the plan and really highlight the things you need written down. So first, here is where you indicate your institution and identify a completion date. That's your date of publishing, and indicate when you will update your plan next. So far, pretty easy. Also listing where your plan is on file, both on and off site. And once we get to that plan management information, we start to get into really what you would call the meat and potatoes of your plan. Situations might change, disasters might be fluid, but so long as there is a clear chain of command and individuals with the right expertise in those roles, you're going to be more prepared to handle complex situations. So you identify specific staff so that they are accountable to these roles, and so that you can call on them to handle a problem that is specific to their expertise. For example, we have chief administrators who will be responsible for the overall outcome of the situation or the decisions that might have a direct impact on the business side of your organization. They may also be the only person who can release specific funds for disaster recovery efforts. The disaster recovery team leader is the coordinator of all other individuals. They might be liaising with first responders and telling other staff to start setting up a drying station. Person in charge of building maintenance may be tackling the underlying issues that caused the disaster in the first place, or trying to manage the environment. Cataloger or a registrar might have the subject and content knowledge needed to inform risky decisions about what needs to stay and what needs to go. And then preservation administrator or conservator, if you had them on staff, is going to essentially be your format and procedure experts for drying materials. And there's space for others to be involved. Some could specialize in things like life safety, public communications is a really important one to consider, and information technology, of course. Your in-house disaster recovery team members can include individuals not listed in a leadership role. You're going to really need people to be physically drying and recovering materials, probably more people than you anticipate. So you'll want these people listed here with their contact information. And a final rule of thumb is that it can't hurt to have backups for all of these roles. So if someone's on vacation, then you have someone else who can step in if need be. And here's an opportunity to list the members of your staff and even the members of the community who might have this plan. So sharing your plan with the fire department or Office of Emergency Management is never a bad idea. But sometimes you may share with certain people an edited version of the plan, especially if there's sensitive information listed within it, like account numbers or access codes or where priority collections are stored. So that's something to be mindful of. And now that you've got your people and plan management in order, you can start to think about the services you can call on. And this list can be very long, and the outline is supposed to help you think of the services that might not be immediately apparent to you before outlining the plan. If you could break this down into groupings, you might think of it as something along the lines of emergency service providers in your local area, like your fire, police, ambulance, etc. And then salvage specific service providers like a freezer company, salvage specialists for different formats, maintenance experts like electricians, plumbers, and locksmiths, and utilities companies, everything from electricity to your internet service provider. Some of these might have you sort of scratching your heads at first, so I'll provide you with a bit of a short list. So I've outlined some of the collection's specific services you want to consider for an emergency situation. And these would be your professional advice, especially for particular formats like conservators, a freeze dry service, a document recovery and salvage service, computer records recovery, and things of that nature. And there are vendors who can help with these sorts of things. So this slide in particular is just a reminder of some of the options that you have. And there are certainly others out there too. But you can include national services, and NEDCC is one of those services that does have a 24-hour emergency hotline. Sometimes I staff that hotline. I'm doing so this month. And we'll talk about this again when we get to the supplies and services section. But typically when it comes to paper, photos, and books, you'll want to start by looking at these 3 regional providers that are listed here, that being Belfour, BMS Cat, and Polygon. And for AV media, there are some specialized services for those, such as Specs Brothers, which widely advertises its role as recovery experts for AV material, and many places from NARA to New York State Archives reference them as well. And you'll also probably get advice from someone different than your in-house salvage specialist. These people are just available as free consultants in a pinch. And like I mentioned, NEDCC and then AIC, National Heritage Responders, we both have 24-hour hotlines that you can call. It's good if you're dealing with a triaging issue, or if you're trying to figure out how to get your salvage operation up and started, and even maybe vetting the recovery methods that have been proposed by an outside vendor. So these are things to sort of plan to put inside of your disaster plan, and maybe make connections with vendors if you plan on using them before a disaster takes place, and setting up an account, maybe getting them accustomed to your collections and your priority items ahead of time. And then the list of services continues into territory that is a little more everyday. And you probably encounter many of these types of service providers in your personal life. Of course, everyone's had to call a plumber on the weekend, myself included. 2 that I would like to point out, especially though, are pest management services and fumigation services. In general, we're pretty hesitant to recommend ever using a fumigant in a collection storage area. And there are pest management companies that are better for cultural heritage sites than others. And I'll actually share another link, a resource on the pest management topics in general. And maybe you've heard of it before. It's a site called Museum Pests. And it has a lot of great resources on pest management and identification, and working with pest management professionals in general. So I highly recommend looking at that site. It's basically sort of the hub for all things bug related in the cultural heritage community. And like I said, they really have a good set of resources on hiring pest management professionals. And here's where we get to equipment and supplies for responding to emergencies. And you'll notice that the statement in parentheses there says list locations and attach floor plans with locations labeled as applicable. Having this information visually represented can be powerful, especially for really large buildings. A lot of people will, use a floor plan to mark out where their fire extinguishers are and master pools for alarms. And that's really nice information to have visually displayed. In this section, you see some life safety. So if you're in a department or organization within a larger organization, somebody might have already figured out life safety equipment and supplies, or your Office of Emergency Management might be encouraging libraries and other units on campus to be doing this on their own, perhaps. Some things to highlight. PPE, or personal protective equipment, is a good thing to have for mold blooms and dangerous flooding if they occur. You'll need to get fit tested for a lot of this type of equipment in order to use it properly. And sometimes your businesses can provide a fit test. If you're at a university, that might be the Office of Emergency Management. An emergency preparedness kit is basically a to-go bag that might be useful in an evacuation or a power outage. Front desk staff may find it helpful, or facility staff might find the basic tools like a flashlight helpful. And this is also a good time to remind you that though we're outlining this document, it is modifiable. So whatever you see here, you're of course allowed to change to fit your needs. And we mentioned floor plans, but if you have a floor plan, this is a really great place to attach it. And the floor plan can show emergency exits, your fire extinguishers, evacuation routes, and emergency shutoffs or water and gas systems. This doesn't just have to be about utilities and equipment and supplies. You can also add priority collections or even identify drying spaces on a floor map. If you have any other documents about your location that you think are relevant, maybe like a campus map if you're part of a university, or notes about problem areas where a leaky roof persists, you can also include those. But it does help to keep in mind that you should be a little judicious about it. You don't want to be sticking tons of extra stuff into your disaster plan. So make this easily accessible to your staff and emergency responders. In most cases, the floor plan won't change that frequently, so you can make a bunch of laminated copies and share them as needed. The exception, of course, would be if you're in an institution where you have rotating exhibits, maybe those exhibit spaces do change. And depending on how dramatically those get reworked, you may need to make note of changes to access points or items of interest when a new exhibit is installed. And the next is facilities equipment. Tracking down this information serves two purposes. First, it can help first responders and recovery specialists really navigate your building. And it can help all facility staff and collection staff understand the equipment in the building. In some institutions, the temporary loss of a facility specialist, whether it's from a vacation or an illness or just anything, it might mean that no one can shut off the water at your institution. So it's really important to work with facility staff to get this information and come to an agreement on who should access this equipment in a pinch. They'll know what's too much to handle for a layperson. So this might even turn into a training tool for facility staff too. So if you wanted to add to this outline, you could go so far as to include instructions for actually shutting these systems off. And I've actually seen disaster plans where there's photo documentation of how to do this type of shut off. So just another thing to consider if that's something you feel compelled to do. It can be very helpful. And lastly, here's everything for responding to collections issues. Minus supply kits, because that's actually going to be our next slide. It's broken down by what can physically be grouped together. Overall, this is a comprehensive list. And I want to explain a few things that might not be readily understandable, but we have listed portable tables, and those are going to be your go-to surface for in-house drying. Carts and book trucks are good for transport, obviously. And portable fans that are placed low to the ground can help you circulate air, which is just going to speed up recovery. Dehumidifiers will get the humidity levels lower, which also speeds up drying and reduces the chance of mold growth. Extension cords will get all these electrical equipment in the positions that you need them in, and then you have cleaning equipment as well. And there's always going to be cleaning that has to take place as part of the recovery effort. So you might include this information in a set for dry cleaning and a set for wet cleaning materials. So for dry cleaning, like shop vac, broom, dustpan, and wet cleaning, of course, wet vacs, mops, and buckets. And you might break these out into kits or bins. There's some overlap, but I'll give you the general role that these kits play. So a disaster spill kit, usually associated with preventing water from spreading and drying it out where needed. I would say that this type of kit is more complete if it has mops or sorbent rolls to stop water from spreading on the ground, and plastic tarp or sheeting to stop water from above dripping onto items. And then salvage supply kits are associated with the actual process of drying your items. And some notable items would include things like unprinted newsprint and blotter paper for drying items out, including the gutters of books, and clipboard and paper and pencils are useful to have too, to take notes, and also just tracking items in the drying process in general. Some dry chemical sponges are good for soot from fire, and wax paper is good for separating things that are about to get frozen. You could combine these kits, but most water incidents will require both the ability to handle the water and the collections affected by the water. And here are some examples of some sort of pre-made disaster kits. On the top left is just a simple spill kit from a company called New Pig, which sells absorbent socks and mats. And so these range in price. This one is about $50. And on the bottom is a custom kit from the Smithsonian. And it includes things for stopping water like tarps, but all of the items in here are sort of collection focused. You can see, for instance, blotter paper and deli freeze wrap. I will mention that building a custom kit can actually be the most affordable approach, especially when it comes to buying things like blotter paper and notepads and that sort of run-of-the-mill stuff. On the top right is a disaster recovery kit from University Products that does a little bit of both, with a mop bucket and strainer and also polyester sheets. And that one in particular runs around $320. So again, sometimes creating your own kit can be the most affordable and practical approach. But it helps to keep in mind that these are for emergency only. So you don't want people swiping like markers or notepads or batteries from your kits. And I can speak from personal experience that I've had a lot of people sort of pilfer through emergency kits for different things and take them out. And then you're constantly having to replace those supplies. So it just helps to get everyone on board and knowing that these materials are specifically for emergency situations. And depending on the size of your institution, you might want to set up several of these kits and distribute them to different locations where you have collections stored. And just make sure that people know where they are. So keeping a list of where they are, keeping everyone informed, maybe even marking them on your floor plan. And also inventorying them so you can replace supplies as needed. And as a final note on emergency equipment and supplies, you'll want to confirm that everyone has gotten a tour of these services and supplies so that they can actually help in an emergency. This should really ideally be a part of onboarding and annual training, and it should be a regular part of work as a disaster response team member. Consider having everyone review locations and supplies at least twice a year, just to make sure that it's really ingrained. And as we mentioned, there's always a chance that a disaster will require some tools that are not in your wheelhouse, or you might be faced with an emergency that outstrips your current resources. And this is really where the section D comes into play. So you have to think about who you're going to call for all of your equipment and supplies. And this is going to give you the answer to that. There is a little overlap here with the emergency service providers, and that's really just to let you choose where you want to indicate that, either or. Freezer storage companies is one example of some repetition that you might see. You'll also want a daily checklist for your site. Think of these as your detection procedures. And this part of your plan should be copied and used as a walkthrough procedure every day at opening and closing. And I know that I've had some people tell me before that this isn't necessarily realistic, and I've been in charge of opening and closing procedures before myself, so I can see that there's definitely a grain of truth in that statement. But I think it gives you some things to look at, think about, internalize, and try to add to your routine as best as you can. And you could make multiple copies of this or turn it into a Google form, but keeping it in your plan is really helpful because it allows you to sort of manage it and update it with your disaster plan. And then a weekly checklist is, of course, the same type of set of activities. These are just things that don't need to be tested nearly as often. But I just see it as a really good list of things to sort of have on your radar as things to be checking periodically. Then there's the other emergency topics you'll want to consider in your plan. The list is not exhaustive, but it's a good place to start. One of the most critical is the fire drill or evacuation procedure. And every organization should have this in place and should practice it biannually. To accompany this, you should have inspection by the fire department. You might have a separate fire extinguisher inspection as well. Some other trainings to consider include things like active shooter training, which your police department could recommend options for, and even shelter in place training. And it helps to mention that shelter in place training is not the same as we mentioned for like active shooter training. It's more for situations where there might be a tornado or toxic gases that have been released outside. And some housekeeping procedures are also included here. You should take a careful look at your insurance policies, for example, and ask, does it cover your historical materials? Or does it cover so-called acts of God? And review how you actually file a claim. And also think about photographs of your interior and exterior, as these can really be powerful tools in filing a claim. You might want to show what the space looked like prior to the disaster. And lastly, make sure that you have a backup of your collection records. It's going to be hard to recover items if you don't have an inventory for them and know exactly what is missing. And we're nearing the end. I know there's a lot of information that we're pushing through, but you want to really think about where you're setting up your drying station. Find a room that's going to be easy to keep secure so no one can enter the space when you don't want them to. And these items will sit for days drying, and they're going to be vulnerable when they don't have things like book flags in them or inventory information near them. You might not know if something goes missing in that instance. Then think about how easy it will be to control the environment in that space. Is it going to be easy to keep the humidity under control with things like portable dehumidifiers or like a central HVAC system? And also consider how large that space is. Smaller spaces are easy to control for your temperature and humidity, but they will accommodate fewer items. And keep in mind that sometimes the best laid plans go awry. So have backup locations for both your on-site and off-site where you can salvage materials. And I know a lot of places struggle with finding backup locations, but it's something to work toward. And we're also going to cover salvage priorities. Salvage priorities really serve the purpose of informing what you salvage first. And I will say, I've heard many people, say that this is the hardest part of completing the disaster plan. People don't want to feel like their own collections would be less important than another's. They may also struggle to pick the most important collection within their own department. I would still insist that it's a critical part of the planning process. You'll see that the questions you have to ask are very comprehensive and will ensure that items are accurately prioritized. But it's a difficult section. It can take some time. And there are a couple of ways to organize and present your priorities. Some people like to go by department, and then across the whole organization is sort of a list of all the department's collections. In terms of how to break up and categorize collections for prioritization, it depends on the nature of the collections. Some items might be so important that they need to be listed individually, but oftentimes you'll be grouping and categorizing by format, archival collection, or even more broad groupings. Thinking about the types of collections that this type of organization might have, you might categorize like all of your Office of the President's papers in one grouping. But let's say you have an incredibly distinguished alumnus, perhaps an artist, and their papers might get their own grouping. So maybe you have motion picture film in your collection. And if that's the case, you might want to schedule that as one of your top priorities, because if it gets very wet and then dries, it basically sticks together and becomes unsalvageable. So the options are really endless and very specific to your organization. This is a very important part of the disaster plan. And this may seem more like a collections management task, but if you have a whole storage room underwater, you need to know what's worth waiting in for. What do you want to send out for remediation, and what can wait? What can actually be thrown out? Items on loan, for instance, would come pretty high on your list of things to try to salvage. Collections you're legally obligated to save, also pretty high on your list. Or unique resources that can't be replaced and aren't redundant. And you might consider collections that are used in a variety of ways as a priority. And these factors will all affect your salvage priorities. And in the end, you're going to need some basic procedures for salvage. This is the most technical stage of the process in general. And I want to emphasize that you can get very step-by-step and technical, or you can go the other way and keep it brief and simple. And I'm going to show you 3 ways that I actually really like to see procedures organized in these next couple of slides, our last slide. But I'll highlight that the resources here are to help you cover a wide variety of formats to be salvaged and formatting for how you organize your instructions. So first, there are examples like NEDCC's preservation leaflets, and those can be a great resource for salvage. They can walk you through things like emergency salvage of wet books and records, or photographs, or moldy books and paper. This is a narrative format, so that's something to keep in mind. And then the Minnesota Historical Society has a nice example of how they organize their information. And you can see that it's not so much a narrative format, but it lays things out nicely so that you can see the priority and some handling precautions right up front. It also includes priority levels of materials and handling precautions, as I mentioned, preparation for drying, what supplies you need. So this is just another format for that salvage information. And then we have salvage at a glance. This is a personal favorite, and I had mentioned it before, but this is just a chart that you can literally print and include with your plan, or leave it in desks, areas where staff are, for initial salvage guidance. It's really easily digestible information to look at in a pinch. So I think this is a really critical resource. Okay, we're at the finish line, and I know everyone has been paying a lot of attention for a very long time, but we're almost done. We're just going to do a really quick review before we wrap it up and have a few minutes for questions. So here's our roadmap to preparedness. And I think this order of tasks sort of makes the most sense, but of course you'll need to tweak it to suit the needs of your organization. And you're going to start by forming your disaster team, that committee of people from different departments with different authority and responsibilities. The first team activity would be to conduct the risk assessment of the building and facilities, and then you'll analyze different ways of mitigating those risks. And as you begin your disaster plan, remember, you're not writing some tome or like huge thesis, you're just gathering resources. That's a really good way to frame it. And you can use information and policies you have in place, and then fill out the different sections of the plan as needed. And once the plan is established, you can share it with your staff and set up training opportunities to familiarize everyone with the procedures that you've just designed. And of course, you'll have to keep that plan current. So you have to update it and share it with new staff. And this is all very doable. It helps to put things on a schedule, just so you're sure that you're taking a look at it on an annual basis. Okay, so we have run through all of our information, and I want to thank you all again for your time and attention. And we have a few minutes for any questions if you have them. So feel free to put questions in the chat. And of course, there's also the number and email for NEDCC here. So if you go away, you rewatch the recording, or you think of some questions later, absolutely do not hesitate to contact us. That is what we do. And you're very welcome, Megan. Thank you. I'll turn on my camera so you can see me before we wrap up as well. how do I feel about the D plan? I like the D plan. It's something that NEDCC works on, and I think it's a good way to make it just that much easier to get all of your resources in one place. And I think it's in the process of sort of being updated somewhat too. So that's something to watch for. You're welcome. Yeah, it was a pleasure to spend the afternoon with everyone, even though it's a bit earlier here in California. Thank you. I appreciate that. And I think this recording is going to be available too. Is that correct, Jamie?
Yeah, we usually put them up on the YouTube channel that we have. I don't know if there's an automated email, but we, if you just check back on that YouTube, we can, I think it usually goes up a week or so after.
Okay. And I'm going to reshare the shared folder link. Bethany is asking what the YouTube channel name is.
1 second, I'll put the link in the chat.
Okay. Ask and ye shall receive. I'm actually surprised that I was able to make it through all of that content within the 3 hours. I was a little worried, but it happened. Yep. There's the link.
No, that was great. Thank you so much for doing this. I'll
Oh,
leave the
yeah.
room open for a couple more minutes in case there's any
Sure.
questions.
Yeah. And I think that the link went directly to me as a direct message.
Oh, that's weird.
I think it defaults to that, like the last person that you direct message, it just keeps
Oh, I
it.
see. There you go.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
It was nice to meet everyone. And I think I saw at the beginning that some people were attending from outside of Missouri, like way outside of Missouri, maybe.
Yeah, I thought I saw somebody from, hold on. Venezuela.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
so. Our reach is international.
And
In Alaska. Oh, cool.
Very cool.
That's awesome.
Well, I think that concludes it. So I'm going to stop the recording and thanks everybody for attending.
That sounds good. And if you don't need anything else from me, I guess I will stop sharing and go rest my voice.
Yeah, that was great. I am very unprepared and I don't know what the next one will be, but there will be an email blast for the next webinar or colleague conversation. So Thank
Yeah,
you,
that sounds
everyone.
great. Yeah, and you're welcome, everyone. Thanks for spending time with me this afternoon. I hope you carried some useful information away from it. So nice to meet you all. Hope to see you again.